Welcome to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine that we put together here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy so you can go forth into your day feeling like no matter what you come across at the backyard fence or the water cooler or riding on a bus somewhere, you'll have something profound to be able to put the craziness back into its box. And pretty much one of the best people to go to for all of this is the Senior Investigative Researcher at the Capitol Research Center. Hayden Ludwig is back on the program with us, also a columnist with the Washington Free Beacon. And thank you for taking some time out with us, Hayden, to take us into a really murky story, and we'll get into it in a moment. But I hope you're doing well this Halloween weekend.
Doing very well. I'm glad to be back on the show, Joe.
So you've written a column about creation care. And I was reading it, and it struck me that we have some congressional races where ordained ministers are purporting to be hardcore Biden administration supporting leftists, which seems to fly in the face of what I would imagine an ordained minister or Christian would be like. But your column really lays out how we get from there to here. And first, I guess for the folks who have never heard the expression, explain what creation care means.
Creation care is a set of doctrines that are trying to be put into conservative evangelical churches by a combination of liberal pastors, or pastors are being taken advantage of through ignorance, but also their activist allies in the professional left, especially in Washington, D.C. Specifically, creation care is a way of redefining the historical Christian understanding of conservation of natural resources, stuff we find in the Bible going all the way back to Genesis, in order to make it compatible or replace that with the environmental left's understanding of, well, environmentalism, climate change, global warming, things like this. It's paired with an attempt to redefine the term pro-life to mean, opposed to abortion, principled on a life position, and make it something like we're opposed to methane in certain power plants, or opposed to natural gas and oil extraction. We're opposed to gas-driven cars. Everything that the environmental left supports.
It's an amazing rebranding that would make George Orwell say, hey, I was writing a book of fiction, guys. Who told anyone it was a toolkit? When you rebrand, now you use a phrase, the evangelical left, and I've never heard that phrase used either. But you talk about progressive pastors. The corruption of these men of the cloth away from what is their text, it fascinates me because I don't get it. It seems like a group that should not exist. But then again, you've got a pope in Rome that is one of the most ardent global socialists out there. So I guess anything is possible. Is it just a corruption of the idea of helping thy neighbor, and it just grows into tax everyone else and force the neighbors into a collective system?
There was a time when evangelical left was an oxymoron. Unfortunately, that's no longer the case. Evangelicalism has lost a lot of its savor. It is a corruption, but I think it's even more than that. There was a fellow about 100 years ago, a fellow Presbyterian actually, named John Gresham Machen, who wrote a great book called Christianity and Liberalism. And I think he actually points out very rightly that liberalism, liberal Christianity, is actually a different religion altogether than Christianity. It disregards all the historic creeds and doctrines and understandings of the church about Christ and the Godhead, but also about man's role as being created good and falling due to disobedience into sin and introducing death into the world. Well, liberalism denies all of those things because it's another form of secular humanism. And so it is this creation care stuff is a corruption of the historic understanding, but really what it is, more than that, it is a foreign religion bringing foreign doctrines and ideals that are antithetical to the gospel that Christians have always understood into the churches. And this is why it's already taken over all of the quote-unquote mainstream big Protestant denominations. Roman Catholicism is having its own battle with a version of creation care. It goes by a slightly different name. But what the basic understanding of this is that man wasn't created good. Man is evil, right? Man isn't evil because of sin. Man was made evil if he was made at all. And therefore, he's a blight upon the planet. Whereas the Bible teaches very clearly that, well, no, God put man, Adam and Eve, in charge of stewarding the earth and on all of its resources. Mm-hmm. That means being prudent with how we use it, but that also means using it. It means using it and enjoying all of these things. In fact, the very first commandment Adam is given is to fill the earth and multiply and have dominion over it. But right. This leftism sees that man is evil and should not do any of those things, and that's what they're trying to rebrand as quote-unquote biblical.
Well, you mentioned secular humanism, and maybe if this isn't as great a feat of legerdemain as when Václav Klaus outed the Green Agenda people in his book Blue Planet in Green Shackles as just rebranding of Soviet communism with a green agenda instead of a red agenda. This might be even a darker bit of linguicism, Hayden.
I think so. I know that if you approached most conservative evangelicals or Roman Catholics and you asked them if they're pro-life, almost all of them would agree, yes, of course I am. And they understand that means that I'm opposed to abortion, but it also means that life is a principle, right? I don't just merely oppose abortion, but I see life as a wonderful blessing given to us by the Lord. Well, if you understand that environmentalism, even if it's pitched as, well, we're just taking care of the planet, don't you see? We want to be holistically pro-life, one of the phrases that these people will use. Yeah. If you understand that really what they're saying is they're going back to a common ancestor with the pro-abortion movement, back about in the 1930s and 40s, you can trace the modern environmental movement's roots to women like Margaret Sanger, right, the founder of Planned Parenthood. They have common ancestors. Matter of fact, if you go back to about the 1950s, you'll find individuals who were both the head of major abortion groups in the United States and head of organizations like the Sierra Club, one of the leading, quote-unquote, green groups in America. Oh. And the reason is they both have a very unbiblical way of viewing God and mankind.
Well, it almost smacks of what Jane Goodall said just recently about rolling back the population 500 years, and I think even if not the foundation, because there's the whole Bill and Melinda split, but certainly Bill Gates has talked about overpopulation. Is this the fruits of the population bomb cult of Paul Ehrlich back in the 60s?
Yeah, I think that's exactly what it is. I think people would be shocked how many of our billionaires, men mostly on the left, who are totally convicted of the foolish idea that the world has reached its carrying capacity, a term that was created by an abortion activist in the 1950s who was also involved with these environmental groups. The population control movement really has its start in the Darwinist movement of 100 years ago. Darwin's theory is much older than that, of course, but if you go back to the 1920s, let's say, you have the beginnings of the ideas of eugenics, where we need to shape the future of humanity by stopping these quote-unquote unfit people from having children so that these beautiful, perfect, we might call them Aryan people in certain countries, right, can have children. Well, that led to all these ideas of we need to forcibly sterilize people. You flash forward to the 1960s, in India, you'll find that the Ford and Rockefeller Foundation spent many millions of dollars trying to use the socialist government of India to forcibly sterilize men and women all over the country. It got so bad that in certain northern provinces of India, they called it the vasectomy belt because police officers would ride in on horseback and they'd hold a gun to certain families until the man would get a vasectomy. Sometimes they beat them or withhold food, or this being a socialist country, withhold government jobs, which are about the only jobs anybody could get there. So this is a very dark history that most people aren't going to be aware of when they hear the term creation care, but they should put it in context with the rest of environmentalism and the anti-life movement.
Well, you mentioned all of this, and the University of Virginia has a dark past in the eugenics movement to a great degree. But didn't even Darwin recant a lot of that before he passed?
That's an interesting point. I don't know too much about Darwin's personal life, but I can tell you that one of his cousins is a man named Francis Galton. And Francis Galton lived in the late 19th century, and he's the fellow who coined the term eugenics. He was actually a very brilliant statistician, was kind of an odd bird. He would go around, he was English, he would go around various British cities, and he found a way to basically put a notebook in his pocket, and he could record how attractive the women in each city were so that he could go back to a laboratory, again, very strange fellow, and tell you which city had the most attractive British women in the entire country.
Yeah,
they'll tell you that where this comes from is a strange place.
Oh my God, yeah, because that won't get you banned on the internet right now if you try doing the same thing.
It was a different time, yes.
Hayden Ludwig is on with us from the Capital Research Center, and his piece on creation care and the darkness that it is. Is this, and as you understand the founding of America, and we've got a whole other world here where we're trying to brand Jefferson and Madison as a racist. They're currently going after some library systems so then they can go after their work product. Because certainly, Hayden, you wouldn't want a government based on the work of a racist. But if the cornerstone of this country is that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with unalienable rights, doesn't this secular humanism become patently an un-American thought? Because if we're not endowed by our Creator with these responsibilities like stewardship of the earth, we're also not endowed with rights.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, these ideas would have been extraordinarily foreign to the men and women who, well, the men who signed the Declaration of Independence, but also the men and women who sacrificed in the war for independence themselves. These people didn't go and do that for philosophy or for ideological ideas, many of which didn't exist yet. They did so because they were convicted by what they read in the Bible, what they heard in the pulpits all the time. People forget this now, but the war cry of the American War for Independence was "No king but Jesus." And you know where they got that from was 100 years before, the Puritans fighting for a republic in England in the English Civil War. There was a great history here, and it was always led by evangelical Christians. We've totally forgotten that these days. And I think a lot of the reason why is because when we shifted to a culture that takes evolution more seriously than the Bible, than Genesis, right? When we've gotten into that, what we exchanged was a one worldview for another. And when you exchange the biblical worldview, you lose the author of morality, you lose the value of humanity in God's creation, and you exchange it for this idea that really all human beings are a collection of selves, right? Your thoughts, your feelings, your memories are nothing more than chemicals, according to this idea. And when you do that, well, you can reduce everything down to meaninglessness. Nobody has any value. As they say, you know, when people in the camps in the Holocaust looked up, there's nothing but sky above them, according to this idea. Well, that's not how this country was founded. That's not how I want to raise my children.
No.
And if we reject that social engineering, we have to reject creation care as well.
Not that we want to teeter on a weekend morning along with church services or anything like that, Hayden, but as far as I understand in my following of the Christian faith, one of the cornerstones of it is a humility that seems to also be anathema to what these creation care people are about. It's almost born of arrogance that we're, what's the line from Inherit the Wind? Man created God in his own image, and man being a kind soul returned the favor. I mean, this is smacking of that kind of arrogance that we know better than the people who put all this together.
Yes, I think that's exactly right. Yeah, I keep going back to the early 20th century, but it's where you can see a lot of this stuff come to life. There was an individual named Madison Grant. He was a New Yorker, a very rich man. He was good friends with Theodore Roosevelt and all of these leading quote unquote progressives of that time, right? Mm-hmm. The progressive age, and talk about a guy who really exemplifies what we're trying to illustrate. Grant helped found the Brooklyn Zoo, which is the largest zoo in North America. He was one of the individuals who helped to create the national park system. He popularized true good conservation, the way that Christians should embrace, the kind that Christians should embrace. At the same time, he also wrote books that were about the pseudoscience of superior quote-unquote Nordic people, right, over Mediterranean people or Asians or Africans or anything like that. Well, his books, there was one book called The Passing of the Great Race, referring to Europeans. That book was used in defense of certain Nazi scientists and high-ranking senior officials in the Nuremberg trials in 1945. Mm-hmm. So they looked at this stuff and they said, well, all that our regime was doing was putting these ideas that Americans and Englishmen had created, putting them into practice. And people forget now, but there was a common saying in the Third Reich that National Socialism is nothing but applied biology. And what they meant is exactly what I said earlier, that human beings can be molded and shaped like putty. Well, I can't think of anything that's further from what we find in Scripture or what any Christian in this country really believes.
Well, yeah, and anytime I run into anyone who espouses that, I said, okay, who gets to decide that? Who makes that determination? And they blanch because they really want to say they do, but they realize polite conversation would preclude that. But when you talk about this, and of course we know historically the final solution, a lot of it was just taken from our Jim Crow laws, and they changed one word for another, one race for another. So we were already doing this as a country. The progressives, and as you mentioned, 100 years this has been building. I wonder, is this, and I don't want to use the phrase because somebody will say, oh, Joe, you're just being incendiary, so I won't say final solution, but is this not, if this is becoming quasi-religious, and we already see this with a lot of the zealotry about environmentalism, that it takes on this religious cult kind of, when you talk to somebody, you feel like you're talking to somebody who's defending, Reverend Jones, and you're like, no, he's really, it's for the best. That kind of thing, if they get this built into churches, how do you fight something that not only seems like a religion, but actually has infested and taken over the host body of a religion?
Well, I think the first thing is it takes a religious person to recognize a religious person, right? And as one of those, very clearly, I can recognize when I'm speaking to somebody who's making faith arguments, even if they're not using terms like God and sin and Bible and whatever, right? And that's what we're dealing with when we're talking about true dyed-in-the-wool environmental activists. They don't usually realize it, but that's exactly the kind of language that they're using. The second thing is you have to recognize what you're dealing with. If you start to hear language, and you might not hear the term creation gear, that's something that was basically created in an activist laboratory because they thought that that's the thing that's going to get conservative evangelicals on board. But it goes by a number of different terms. The things you have to recognize are the buzzwords that they sound like scripture light, but they don't contain any of the substance that Christians have grown up with and recognize in the scriptures. And that is things, like I said earlier, being holistically pro-life or completely pro-life. And that means extending that term beyond abortion. When you hear somebody start talking about the way we drive our cars, the way we, the food that we consume, things like that, they're no longer talking about what pro-life issues. Now they're talking about issues that are beyond that, and probably because they have an agenda that they're trying to slide in there. Mm-hmm. People need to understand that one of the left's best tactics is not getting you to buy off on a new term like woke. That's actually less common. It's redefining words that you're familiar with. So love is a great example. You hear the term love all the time on the professional left because they didn't create it. They knew that this is something that was created by Christians. The word agape in ancient Greek was something that existed in the ancient Greek culture, but Christians took it and made it so much more powerful than it actually was to the ancient Greeks. Well, the left has tried to do the same thing with that term. So you hear the word love is love to describe gay marriage. Well, that's because they think it's going to soften the arguments against them. So you have to pay attention to that. Mm-hmm. And if you're going to a church where you hear this sort of thing and you've spoken to your pastor and you can't get them to see that you're buying off on something that is antithetical to the gospel and is going to lead us away from the truths of the Lord, then consider leaving your church. Consider finding one that's going to actually stick to historic Christian orthodoxy. Otherwise, I see a short slope down into oblivion. And once you lose the gospel in a church, it's very hard to reclaim it. Of a senior fellow at this group called the New America Foundation. It's a left-wing think tank in Washington, D.C., and she's a strategist who's helped come up with, she has research articles about studying how conservative evangelicals think and speak, and then has used that to boil down principles that leftists can use to communicate to conservative evangelicals and get them on board with their ideas, hence creation care. And there's a clip of her saying that we are perfecting a, quote, rent an evangelical pastor model. The idea being we get these people and either we pay them directly or we subsidize their ministry, but more importantly, We give them all of the tools. We produce their sermons for them. We produce all of this pamphlets and this literature that they can then disseminate down to their congregations to correct them from the top down. That's what they're trying to do. I'm not sure how well they're going to succeed in doing this because they don't know how to communicate to your average Christian very well, even with all of these PhDs. But I do know that there's a lot of money behind it from these very large foundations that believe this is the way to destroy evangelicalism as a cohesive political unit because that's their main interest, politics.
Hayden Ludwig is on with us, and certainly much of what you've done is talked about, where this money is coming from. And, the minute anyone named Koch gives money to, say, the Capital Research Center or the Virginia Institute for Public Policy, we have to know who's behind all this money. But just like the other day, we were talking with Chris Horner from Government Oversight, and the Bloomberg folks were trying to make a big deal that somebody who had at one time been an oil company gave money to his group. It's bad for us, but it's fine for them to have these funding groups, these mega church kind of operations. They're going to have success, though, because sloth is one of our sins, Hayden. And if somebody says, oh, I can run a church and have it be easy and kind of just, open the doors and start handing out the leaflets, that's good for me. And I get to keep a little taste on the side. That's sloth. I often refer to it as the emperor of all the sins, because it seems like all the other ones seed off of sloth. Everything is easier if we do it this way. Talk about the people who are funding this kind of stuff, because I guess it's not necessarily the zealotry of the faux priest, but who's paying for them that needs to be called out.
I think the top advocacy organization for creation care is a group called the Evangelical Environmental Network, EEN.
Ooh.
And when we trace the funders to this group, if you go to its website, it's a faux conservative group. But if you look at its funders, it's the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, which, of course, goes from John D. Rockefeller, who got his money in Standard Oil, but then his foundation in 2014 proudly divested from all oil, which is the great irony of our day, right? But also the Energy Foundation. That's a big pass-through to similar kinds of groups like Sierra Club and Greenpeace, groups that are involved in far-left environmental and energy policy work. They actually have very disturbing ties to China. There's a Chinese arm of the Energy Foundation. It's very murky. But also Greenpeace and Sierra Club, all of these different kinds of large foundations that are funding all of this stuff. So, I don't know anybody who thinks that if we know the funders, but somehow the funders' ideology has nothing to do with the cause they're funding. I don't know anybody who wouldn't be alarmed by that if you're a conservative, because clearly these foundations, which are giving on the one hand to groups that support the Green New Deal, right, are not going to give to a cause that is antithetical to the Green New Deal. It doesn't work that way. They have a very clear ideology, and it's very counter to what most Christians in this country believe, and that should be the thing that raises huge alarm bells.
One last one, and this is sort of the theology Americana, Hayden, and I know that this has no association outside of the fact that we talk about George Mason a lot around here, and his role in crafting the Bill of Rights and really saving this country from the ignominious end that most free republics wind up with in the time frames of 50 to 100 years. But it kept the centralized government from having this kind of authority. I look at the almost $80 trillion in debt that the country owes on the expenditures it's made, and I think about that, and I think about this kind of movement and how it behooves them to promote a centralized, pardon the phrase, Godhead government, authoritarian, centralized government that was, even Madison didn't want it. Mason helped him kind of put in some toolkits to block it. Have we passed a Rubicon with these, with our centralized government and the funding streams, and that it's just going to wind up going there before it breaks?
Yeah, it's a great question. I wonder about that too. When I was significantly younger, I used to think that the arguments of the Federalist side of the Constitution, right? The guys like John Adams or George Washington or Alexander Hamilton, we need a stronger central government because the one they had under the Articles of Confederation was just so paltry and weak, couldn't do anything real. I used to think that their arguments were really good. Well, they are. They still are good. But, these days, seeing what we're living through with this extraordinary centralization, I mean, you just look at the way our elections are being run, the takeover, the attempt to federalize what is very clearly a state-run initiative in the Constitution, our election system. I tend to think more and more that guys like Patrick Henry and George Mason were right. Their concerns about the Constitution, wonderful as that document is, they were concerned not with what it was, but with what it would allow. And all of these men, even the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, they could all agree that all of this will only work. This big experimental republic will only function as long as we have a serious God-fearing religious people here. And, we have changed a lot in the last 200-plus years. And, personally, I will say I am actually very optimistic. Maybe it's my age,
Good.
but, I am optimistic at what I see, the great darkness around us right now. I see a large revival on the people here. I see a lot of people who are, the growth in Christian homeschooling is extraordinary. In the 1950s, there was virtually nobody outside of maybe the Amish who are homeschooling their kids. And in the last decade since that, there has been an extraordinary rise by the million. Since 2020 alone, there's been, I can't remember the exact number, but 2 to 3 million people, families, have just pulled their kids out of government schools and said, nope, I think we can do a better job. And think about what that's saying. The government school is free. You pay for it in your taxes, but it's free, right?
Yep.
And yet people will still say, no, you can't give it to me for free. You couldn't pay me to put my kids in that place. I'm doing it myself no matter the expense. Well, what does that tell you? That at some point in the past, their hearts were withdrawn from the system, right? They said, no, I'm checking out mentally. And that has to precede any action of pulling my kids out. That's the kind of stuff I look at and I go, I think what God is doing in this country is going to be extraordinary. I think at any moment he could stand back and say, hey, guys, watch this. Watch what I'm about to do.
Boy.
And it will blow our minds.
Well, and you think about it. You think about when the faith has had its greatest resurrections, pun intended, were in challenges like the horrific slave states of America where black families were finding faith. They didn't even come to the United States in Christianity, but they found it and then used that as the shield to get them out of slavery, which as soon as they learned Christianity was, it was a mandate. They couldn't stay in slavery if they followed Christian faith, or what the underground Russian Orthodox churches did to help bring down the fall of the communist authoritarian dictatorships. The faith usually looks for these dark places and shines the light the brightest, doesn't it, Hayden?
I think you're absolutely right. And all of that kind of conversion in your heart and in your mind has to take place before you see the changes, proliferate out into the rest of the culture and then from there, the politics. It took a long time. It took millennia for anybody but the West to extinguish slavery. Isn't it amazing that the Civil War, or in Britain when they destroyed slavery for the British Navy, that was preceded by a huge Great Awakening in both countries, this outpouring of the gospel that changed people's minds and hearts. I mean, everybody knows the song Amazing Grace, right? And John Newton, the great Calvinist behind that, who wrote that, who was a slave ship captain himself, a master of a ship, involved in that sort of thing. These people's hearts had to change before they could take action. And when I say action, I don't mean anything revolutionary. I mean simply, how do we raise our children? Do we pay attention to what they're doing, right? Where do we go to school? Where do we tithe in our churches? What kind of communities are we drawn to? Do we live in? That kind of stuff is small and seems like it's insignificant. But, it's amazing how you can look back on the era right before the American Revolution, and you can see exactly that sort of thing happening on our side of the world, and how 20 years after that, you have this sea change where suddenly the people are mature enough to govern themselves. And I think that's happening, but on a much faster clip than even then.
Well, let's hope your work and our words to it, Hayden, hasten the people's idea that, oh no, that really wasn't what I thought. I thought it was a church I was in. Where's Jesus in here? Because really, when you think about it, there is only one authoritarian, and he actually sacrificed his own son for us. Hayden Ludwig, Senior Investigative Researcher, I appreciate you taking some time out. Please go to capitalresearch.org and read his piece. It's chilling. I mean, the use of these Christian-sounding phrases. It's got to be outed. Share it with all your friends, and then share it with more friends once they all have read it. Hayden, I appreciate it. You have a wonderful weekend, sir.
You as well, my friend. Thank you.